Today we'll be reading from René Girard's work, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, originally published in 1999. Though Girard only claimed to be a literary critic, this work of his, since most of it deals so directly with Scripture, is some of the closest to theology that we'll find. That makes it especially interesting to Christians. This is from chapter 4 of the book, a chapter titled The Horrible Miracle of Apollonius of Tyana. This chapter, in my opinion, serves as a great and relatively short introduction to Girard's thought about the Gospels and the roots of violence in society. Apollonius of Tyana was a celebrated guru of the 2nd century after Christ. Among the pagans, his miracles were viewed as superior to those of Jesus. The most spectacular is certainly his healing of a plague epidemic in the city of Ephesus. We possess an account of it thanks to Philostratus, a Greek writer of the following century, and the author of The Life of Apollonius of Tyana. The Ephesians could not get rid of this epidemic. After many remedies that did not work, they turned to Apollonius, who, by supernatural means, came to them in the blink of an eye and announced their immediate healing. "Take courage, for I will today put a stop to the course of this disease." And with these words, he led the population in Tyre to the theater, where the image of the averting god has been set up. The averting god in this case is Hercules, as will become clear later. And there he saw what seemed an old mendicant artfully blinking his eyes as if blind, and he carried a wallet and a crust of bread in it. And he was clad in rags and was very squalid of countenance. Apollonius therefore ranged the Ephesians around him and said, "Pick up as many stones as you can, and hurl them at this enemy of the gods." Now the Ephesians wondered what he meant, and were shocked at the idea of murdering a stranger, so manifestly miserable, for he was begging and praying them to take mercy upon him. Nevertheless, Apollonius insisted and egged on the Ephesians to launch themselves on him and not let him go. And as soon as some of them began to take shots and hit him with their stones, the beggar who had seemed to blink and be blind gave them all a sudden glance and showed that his eyes were full of fire. Then the Ephesians recognized that he was a demon, and they stoned him so thoroughly that their stones were heaped into a great cairn around him. After a little pause, Apollonius bade them remove the stones and acquaint themselves with the wild animal which they had slain. When therefore they had exposed the objects which they thought they had thrown their missiles at, they found that he had disappeared, and instead of him there was a hound who resembled in form and look a Molossian dog, but was in size the equal of the largest lion. There he lay before their eyes, pounded to a pulp by their stones, and vomiting foam as mad dogs do. Accordingly, the statue of the averting god, namely Hercules, has been set up over the spot where the ghost was slain. A more horrible miracle would be hard to find. If the author were Christian, he certainly would have been accused of slandering paganism. But Philostratus is a militant pagan, resolved to defend the religion of his ancestors. He obviously viewed the murder of the beggar as able to lift up the morale of his co-religionists, to reinforce their resistance to Christianity. From the standpoint of public opinion, his calculation was sound. His book was so successful that Julian the Apostate put it back into circulation in the 4th century as he made his last attempt to save paganism. However fantastic the conclusion may be, Philostratus's narrative is too rich in concrete details to be completely invented. The miracle consists of triggering a mimetic contagion so powerful that it finally polarizes the entire population of the city against the unfortunate beggar. The initial refusal of the Ephesians is the sole ray of light in the dark text, but Apollonius does everything he can to extinguish it, and he succeeds in doing so. The Ephesians start stoning their victim with such rage that they finally see him, as Apollonius demands, the source of all their misfortunes, the plague demon that must be expelled in order to heal the city. To describe the behavior of the Ephesians once the stoning begins, I am tempted to resort to a modern phrase, letting off steam. The more the Ephesians obey their guru, the more they are transformed into a violent mob, and the more they let off steam, releasing their rage against the unfortunate beggar. Another classic phrase comes to mind, the metaphor of the abscess of fixation was often employed in the grand era of comparative religious studies. Apollonius channeled the violent contagion he released among the Ephesians toward a universally accepted target, and thus he satisfies their appetite for violence, which takes a bit of time to awaken, and which awakens only to be satisfied by the stoning of the victim designated by the guru. When their rage has been released, when the abscess of fixation has played its role, the Ephesians discover they are cured of the epidemic. A third metaphor, not modern but ancient, is catharsis, or purification. Aristotle employs this word to describe the effect of the tragedies on the spectators. It means, first of all, the effect of sacrificial rituals, of bloody sacrifices on those participating in them. Apollonius's miracle embodies the kernel of a teaching rightly termed religious, which would escape us if we took the miracle to be imaginary. By no means an unheard-of phenomenon, alien to what we know about the Greek world, the stoning of the beggar recalls certain religious facts that are specifically Greek, the sacrifices of people called pharmakoi. These sacrifices were real collective assassinations of individuals similar to the beggar of Ephesus. I will return to this shortly. The prestige of Apollonius is all the more sinister in that it may well have some basis in reality. The stoning passes for miraculous because it put an end to the complaints of the Ephesians. But you will say to me, how could the murder of a beggar, no matter how unanimously committed, make a plague epidemic go away? In the ancient and medieval world, the word plague was often used in a sense that is not strictly medical. Almost always it included a social dimension. Until the Renaissance, wherever real epidemics occurred, they disrupted social relations. Wherever social relations were disrupted, epidemics could occur. The fact that both kinds of plague are contagious facilitates the confusion. If Apollonius had intervened in the context of a bacterial plague, the stoning would not have had any effect on the epidemic. The clever guru must have gauged the situation and known that the city was prey to internal tensions that could be discharged on what we now call a scapegoat. This fourth metaphor designates a substitute victim, some innocent substitute for the real antagonists. In the life of Apollonius of Tyana, just prior to the miracle itself, there is a passage that confirms our conjecture. Just before the narrative of the miraculous stoning, Apollonius is in a seaport with some followers. There, the sight of a ship about to depart inspires him to make some remarkable observations on order and disorder in societies. Apollonius sees the crew as a community whose success or failure depends on the nature of the relations between its members. Now, if a single member of the community abandoned any one of his particular tasks, or went about his naval duties in an inexperienced manner, they would have a bad voyage, and would themselves impersonate the storm. But if they vie with one another and are rivals only with the object of one showing himself as good a man as the other, then their ship will make the best of all havens, and all their voyage will be one of fair weather and fair sailing, and the precaution they exercise about themselves will prove to be as valuable as if Poseidon, our Lord of Safety, were watching over them. In short, there are good rivalries, and there are bad ones. There is the healthy emulation of those who rival one another only in efficiency, each one doing his duty. There are the unhealthy rivalries of those who do not master themselves. Not contributing at all to the smooth operation of societies, these unrestrained rivalries only weaken them. Those given over to them will impersonate the storm. It's not external enemies that ruin societies, it's the unlimited ambitions, the unbridled competitions that divide human beings rather than unite them. Philostratus does not define mimetic conflicts as extensively and powerfully as Jesus in his Discourse on Scandals, but he evidently speaks of the same type of conflict, and he speaks about it with unquestionable competence. I have already suggested that the plague of Ephesus is not necessarily bacterial. It is an epidemic of mimetic rivalries, an interweaving of scandals, a war of all against all, which, thanks to the victim selected by the diabolical cleverness of Apollonius, is transformed miraculously into a reconciliation of all against one. Guessing the illness the Ephesians are suffering, the guru arouses violence against a miserable beggar. He expects from this violence a cathartic effect superior to that of ordinary sacrifices or of the tragic dramas that were performed, no doubt, in the theater of Ephesus in the 2nd century of our era. In my view, the warning against mimetic rivalries must be read as an introduction to the miracle. The passage I just cited immediately precedes the chapter devoted to the miraculous stoning, which I quoted in its entirety at the beginning of this chapter. This proximity cannot fail to be intentional. The stoning is an expression of the single victim mechanism, just like the Passion. It is even more effective than the Passion in its violent outcome, since it is completely unanimous and the community feels it is completely cured of its plague epidemic. Eusebius of Caesarea was aware of the harm that the life of Apollonius did to Christianity. Eusebius, the first great historian of the Church, friend and collaborator of Constantine, composed a critique of this book, but modern readers will not find there what they are expecting. Eusebius sets out to show particularly that the miracles of Apollonius are not impressive at all. He never denounces the monstrous stoning, as we would expect of him. He reduces the debate, just like the partisans of the guru, to a mimetic rivalry between miracle workers. This helps us understand why Jesus always refused to emphasize his own miracles. Never does Eusebius really define what decisively separates Apollonius and Jesus. When confronted with victims being stoned, Jesus is poles apart from Apollonius. Jesus doesn't instigate stonings, rather he does all he can to prevent them. Never does Eusebius really say what strikes the eyes of the modern reader. To take the measure of the two spiritual masters on this point, we must compare the miracle manipulated by Apollonius with a text that has nothing of the miraculous, that of the woman whose stoning Jesus prevents. From John 8, chapters 3 through 11. The scribes and the Pharisees brought before him a woman taken in adultery. Placing her in view of everyone, they said to Jesus, "Master, this woman was surprised in the act of adultery. Moses commanded us in the law to stone such women. Now what do you say about it?" They said this to set a trap for him, in order to be able to accuse him. But Jesus, bending down, started writing with his finger on the ground. As they were insistent, he drew up and said to them, "Let whoever is without sin among you cast the first stone at her." And bending down again, he once more began to write on the ground. When he said this, they withdrew one by one, beginning with the oldest. Jesus remained alone with the woman who was still there. Then, standing up again, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus said. "Go and sin no more." Contrary to the Ephesians, who were in a peaceful mood initially and opposed to stoning the beggar, the crowd that brings the adulterous woman to Jesus is in a combative mood. All the action in the two texts pivots on a problem that the single sentence of Jesus makes explicit, whereas it is never clarified by Philostratus, the problem of the first stone. In the miracle of Apollonius, the first stone is plainly the principal worry of the guru, since no Ephesian has the resolve to cast it. This worry is easy to detect, although it never becomes explicit. Apollonius finally resolves the difficulty in the way he desires, but he has to take great pains and work insidiously like the very devil he is. Jesus also overcomes the difficulties confronting him, but contrary to the guru, he exerts his influence against violence. Jesus explicitly mentions the first stone. In fact, he emphasizes it as much as he can, since he places it at the very end of his one-sentence intervention, prolonging its echo as long as possible. One might say, in the memory of his hearers, "Whoever is without sin among you, let him cast at her the first stone." The modern reader, skeptical, suspects a purely rhetorical effect. The first stone is proverbial. Cast the stone, cast the first stone. This is one of those expressions that everyone repeats. Is this really just an effective language? Let us remember that it is this very story of the woman taking an adultery and saved from stoning that has made casting the first stone proverbial. If this saying is still repeated everywhere today, in all the languages where Christianity has spread, it is because of our gospel text, and it is repeated also because of its extraordinary relevance, underscored precisely by the parallelism of the two accounts. When Apollonius orders the Ephesians to gather stones and throw them at the beggar, these good people refuse to do it, and Philostratus naively discloses to us not only this refusal, but the arguments justifying it. The Ephesians could not resolve cold-heartedly to massacre a fellow human, miserable, disgusting, and insignificant though he was. The arguments justifying this refusal have their counterpart in the saying of Jesus. In this instance, they are the equivalent, not of the very last words quoted, but the very first. Whoever among you is without sin. The Ephesians don't accept that they have the right to coldly assassinate a fellow creature in whom they have nothing to reproach. To accomplish his ends, Apollonius has to distract the Ephesians from the deeds he asks them to commit, so he tries to make them forget the physical reality of the stoning. With a ridiculous grandiloquence, he denounces the beggar as an enemy of the gods. To make the violence possible, he must demonize the individual he has selected as victim. And finally, the guru succeeds. He obtains what he desires, the first stone. Once it is thrown, Apollonius can take a nap, or whatever, for now violence and deceit are bound to triumph. The same Ephesians who had pity on the beggar a moment earlier now demonstrate a violent emulation of one another that is so relentless, so contrary to their initial attitude, that our surprise can only equal our sadness. Not purely rhetorical, the first stone is decisive because it is the most difficult to throw. Why is it the most difficult to throw? Because it is the only one without a model. When Jesus finally responds, the first stone is the last obstacle that prevents the stoning. In calling attention to it, in mentioning it expressly, Jesus does all he can to reinforce this obstacle and magnify it. The more those thinking about throwing the first stone perceive the responsibility they would assume in throwing it, the greater the chance that they will let their hands fall and drop the stone. Do we really need a mimetic model for an act as simple as throwing stones? Yes. When the target is a human being, most people do. The positive proof is the initial resistance of the Ephesians. It is certainly not in order to undermine the prestige of Apollonius that Philostratus tells us about his difficulties. These must be real. Once the first stone is thrown, thanks to the encouragement of Apollonius, the second comes fairly fast, thanks to the example of the first. The third comes more quickly still, because it has two models rather than one, and so on. As the models multiply, the rhythm of the stoning accelerates. Saving the adulterous woman from being stoned, as Jesus does, means that he prevents the violent contagion from getting started. Another contagion in the reverse direction is set off, however, a contagion of nonviolence. From the moment the first individual gives up stoning the adulterous woman, he becomes a model who is imitated more and more until finally all the group, guided by Jesus, abandons its plans to stone the woman. Our two texts are as opposed to one another as possible in spirit, and yet they resemble each other since they are two examples of mimetic escalation. Their independent origin makes this resemblance very significant. The texts help us better understand the dynamic of crowds that must be defined not primarily by violence or by nonviolence, but by imitation, by contagious imitation. The fact that Jesus' saying continues to play a metaphorical role universally understood in a world where ritual stoning no longer exists suggests that mimetic contagion remains as powerful today as in the past, though in forms now usually less violent. The symbolism of the first stone is still understandable because the mimetic definition of collective behavior remains just as valid now as it was 2,000 years ago, even if the physical act of stoning is no longer practiced. In order to suggest the tremendous role of violent contagion in human culture, Jesus does not resort to the abstract terms that we can hardly do without: imitation, contagion, mimesis, etc. The first stone suffices. This unique saying permits him to point to the true principle, not only of ancient stonings, but of all crowd phenomena, ancient and modern. Apollonius must induce one or the other of the Ephesians, it doesn't matter which one, to throw the first stone. But he doesn't want to call too much attention to it, and this is why he says nothing expressly about the first stone. Apollonius thus shows his duplicity. He is silent for reasons that match, yet oppose Jesus' motive when he explicitly mentions the first stone, and gives it as much emphasis as possible. The Ephesians' initial hesitation and final relentlessness are so characteristic of violent contagion that our two accounts must portray realistically, accurately, the dynamic structure, which is to say, the mimetic structure of stoning a victim. In order to trigger unanimous violence, the instigator must hide its mimetic nature, and this is what Apollonius does. But to discourage this same violence, light must be shed upon the same nature. The truth about it must be expressed. This is what Jesus does when he emphasizes the first stone. This saying of Jesus, like many memorable sayings, is not original and novel in the way that the modern world appreciates when it demands of its writers and artists an originality in the sense of what has never been said or heard, novelty at all costs. The response of Jesus to the challenge thrown up to him is not original in that sense. Jesus does not invent the idea of the first stone, but he draws it from the Bible. He is inspired by his religious tradition. Legal stoning does not coincide with the arbitrary assassination plotted by Apollonius. The law of Moses provides for stoning in the case of well-defined offenses. Moreover, because the law fears false denunciations, to make these more difficult, it requires the informants, a minimum of 2, to cast the first 2 stones themselves. Jesus transcends the law, but in the law's own sense and direction. He does this by appealing to the most humane aspect of the legal prescription, the aspect most foreign to the contagion of violence, which is the obligation of the 2 accusers to throw the first 2 stones. The law deprives the accusers of a mimetic model. Once the first stones are thrown, all the community must join in the stoning. To maintain order in ancient societies, there is sometimes no other means than this mechanism of contagion and mimetic unanimity. The law resorts to this without hesitation, but as prudently, as parsimoniously as possible. Jesus intends to go beyond the provisions for violence in the law, being in agreement on this point with many fellow Jews of his time. However, he acts always in the direction and spirit of the biblical revelation and not against it. The episode of the adulteress woman is one of the rare successes Jesus has in dealing with a crowd. This success brings out, by contrast, his many failures, and especially, of course, the role of the crowd in his own death. In the gospel episode of the woman, taken in the act of adultery, if Jesus had not convinced the crowd, if the stoning had taken place, Jesus would have risked being stoned himself. Failing to save a victim threatened with collective lynching, being the only person at her side in face of the crowd, is to run the risk of suffering her fate also. This principle is found in all ancient societies. In the period preceding the crucifixion, Jesus himself, the Gospel tells us, narrowly escaped various attempts to stone him. Jesus does not always get off so easily, and he finally played the same role as the beggar of Ephesus by suffering the torture reserved for the lowest of the low in the Roman Empire. Between him and the beggar, there is a resemblance in death, and also resemblance before death, a resemblance in their behavior as each faced the threatening crowd. Before responding to those who asked his advice about the obligation to stone the adulterous woman that is written in the law of Moses, Jesus bends over toward the ground and writes in the dust with his finger. It is not with the intention of writing, in my opinion, that Jesus bends over. It is rather because he is bent that he writes. He bends over to avoid the gaze of these men with bloodshot eyes. If Jesus returned their looks, these angry men would not see his look as it really is, but would transform it into a mirror of their own anger. Their own challenge, their own provocation is what they would read in the look of Jesus, no matter how peaceable it really is, and they would feel provoked in return. The confrontation could no longer be avoided and would bring about what Jesus is trying to prevent, the stoning of the victim. Jesus avoids thus even the shadow of provocation. When Apollonius orders the Ephesians to arm themselves with stones and gather in a circle around the beggar, the latter reacts in a way reminiscent of the behavior of Jesus facing the angry crowd. He too does not want to give these threatening men the impression that he is defying them. His desire to pass for blind, even if it is exclusively professional at the outset, corresponds in my view to the gesture of Jesus writing in the dust. The beggar does not want to look back at his potential assailants. When the stones begin to rain down, he can no longer hope to get away by pretending not to see what is happening about him. His maneuver has failed. So he no longer hesitates to look all around, hoping against hope to discover a breach in the wall of his attackers that would allow him to flee. In the look of the beast tracked down and trapped that the beggar gives the Ephesians, they perceived a kind of defiance. Only at this moment do they believe they recognize their victim as the demon invented by Apollonius. The scene confirms and justifies the caution of Jesus. And as soon as some of them began to take shots at him with their stones, the beggar, who had seemed to blink and be blind, gave them all a sudden glance and showed that his eyes were full of fire. Then the Ephesians recognized that he was a demon. The stoning of the beggar makes us think of the crucifixion. Jesus is finally swept away by a mimetic escalation like the stoning of the beggar. The escalation that he succeeds in reversing in the case of the adulteress woman, in his own case he is unable to prevent. This is just what the crowd gathered at the foot of the cross understands after its own fashion. Mocking the powerlessness of Jesus to do for himself what he has done for others, they cry out, "He who saved others cannot save himself." The cross is the equivalent of the Ephesus stoning. To say that Jesus identifies himself with all victims is to say that he identifies himself not only with the adulterous woman or the suffering servant, but also with the beggar of Ephesus. Jesus is this poor wretch of a beggar.